2. The functional, the phenomenal, and the immaterial. The obvious objection to defining the mental as the intentional is that pains are not intentional. They do not represent. They are not about anything. The obvious objection to defining the mental as the phenomenal is that beliefs don't feel like anything. They don't have phenomenal properties, and a person's real beliefs are not always what they appear to be. The attempt to hitch pains and beliefs together seems ad hoc. They don't seem to have anything in common except our refusal to call them physical. We can gerrymander, of course, so as to make pain the acquisition of a belief that one of one's tissues is damaged, construing pain reports as Pitcher and Armstrong construe perceptual reports. But such a tactic still leaves us with something like a dualistic intuition on our hands, the intuition that there is something more to being conscious of a pain or a sensation of redness than being tempted to acquire a belief that there is tissue damage or a red object in the vicinity. Alternatively, we can gerrymander the other way and simply confine the term mental to what does have phenomenal properties, abandoning beliefs and desires to Armstrong to identify with the physical. But that tactic runs up against the intuition that whatever the mind-body problem is, it is not the feeling neuron problem. If we expel representations, intentional states, from the mind, we are left with something like a problem of the relation between life and non-life, rather than a mind-body problem. Still another tactic would be simply to define mental disjunctively as either phenomenal or intentional. This suggestion leaves it entirely obscure how an abbreviation for this disjunction got entrenched in the language, or at least in philosophical jargon. Still, it does direct our attention to the possibility that the various mental items are held together by family resemblances. If we consider thoughts, occurrent thoughts flashing before the mind in particular words, or mental images, then we seem to have something which is a little like a pain in being phenomenal, and a little like a belief in being intentional. The words make the thoughts phenomenal, and the colors and shapes make the images phenomenal, yet both of them are of something in the required intentional sense. If I suddenly and silently say to myself, "Good Lord, I left my wallet on that cafe table in Vienna," or if I have an image of the wallet on the table, then I am representing Vienna, the wallet, the table, etc. I have all these as intentional objects. So perhaps we should think of thoughts and mental images as the paradigmatic mental entities. Then we can say that pains and beliefs get classified as mental through their resemblance to these paradigms, even though the resemblance is in two quite different respects. The relationship between the various candidates for mentality could then be illustrated by the following diagram. Column 1, with phenomenal properties, intentional, representational, occurrent thoughts, mental images. With phenomenal properties, non-intentional, non-representational, raw feels, e.g. pains and what babies have when they see colored objects. Column 2, without phenomenal properties, intentional, representational, beliefs, desires, intentions. Without phenomenal properties, non-intentional, non-representational, the merely physical. Suppose for the moment that we settle for this family resemblance answer to the question, what makes the mental mental? Viz., that it is one or another family resemblance to the paradigmatically mental. Now let us turn back to our original question and ask what makes us fill in the fourth box with the merely physical. Does physical mean merely what doesn't fit in the other three boxes? Is it a notion which is entirely parasitic on that of mental? Or does it somehow tie in with material and spatial? And how does it do so? To answer this, we have to ask two sub-questions. Why is the intentional non-material? And why is the phenomenal non-material? The first question may seem to have a fairly straightforward answer. If we take the material to be the neural, for example, we can say that no amount of inspection of the brain will reveal the intentional character of the pictures and inscriptions found there. Suppose that all persons struck by the thought, "I left my wallet on the cafe table in Vienna," in those very English words, have an identical series of neural events concomitant with the thought. This seems a plausible, though probably false, hypothesis. But it is not plausible that all those who acquire the belief that they have left their wallet on a cafe table in Vienna have this series of events, for they may formulate their belief in quite other words or in quite another language. It would be odd if a Japanese and an English thought should have the same neural correlate. It is equally plausible that all those who suddenly see the same missing wallet on the same distant table in their mind's eye should share a second series of neural events, though one quite different from that correlated with the thinking of the English sentence. Even such neat concomitants would not tempt us to identify the intentional and the neurological properties of the thought or the image any more than we can identify the typographical and the intentional properties of the sentence, "I left my wallet on a cafe table in Vienna," when we meet it on the printed page. Again, the concomitance of pictures of wallets on cafe tables against a Viennese background, with certain properties on the surface of paper and canvas, does not identify the intentional property being about Vienna, with the arrangement of pigments in space. So we can see why one might say that intentional properties are not physical properties. But on the other hand, this comparison between neurological and typographical properties suggests that there is no interesting problem about intentionality. Nobody wants to make philosophical heavy weather out of the fact that you can't tell merely from the way it looks what a sentence means, or that you can't recognize a picture of X as a picture of X without being familiar with the relevant pictorial conventions. It seems perfectly clear, at least since Wittgenstein and Sellars, that the meaning of typographical inscriptions is not an extra immaterial property they have, but just their place in a context of surrounding events in a language game, in a form of life. This goes for brain inscriptions as well. To say that we cannot observe intentional properties by looking at the brain is like saying that we cannot see a proposition when we look at a Mayan codex. We simply do not know what to look for because we do not yet know how to relate what we see to a symbol system. The relation between an inscription, on paper or given the hypothesized concomitants in the brain, and what it means is no more mysterious than the relation between a functional state of a person, such as his beauty or his health, and the parts of his body. It is just those parts seen in a given context. So the answer to the question, why is the intentional non-material, is because any functional state, any state which can only be grasped by relating what is observed to a larger context, is, in a trivial sense, non-material. The problem is in trying to relate this trivial notion of being non-material, which means merely looking like not immediately evident to all who look, with the philosophically pregnant sense of immateriality. To put it another way, why should we be troubled by Leibniz's point that if the brain were blown up to the size of a factory so that we could stroll through it, we should not see thoughts? If we know enough neural correlations, we shall indeed see thoughts, in the sense that our vision will reveal to us what thoughts the possessor of the brain is having. If we do not, we shall not. But then if we stroll through any factory without having first learned about its parts and their relations to one another, we shall not see what is going on. Further, even if we could find no such neural correlations, even if cerebral localization of thoughts was a complete failure, why would we want to say that a person's thoughts or mental images were non-physical simply because we cannot give an account of them in terms of his parts? To use an example from Hilary Putnam, one cannot give an account of why square pegs do not fit into round holes in terms of the elementary particles which constitute the peg and the hole. But nobody finds a perplexing ontological gap between macrostructure and microstructure. I think that we can link the trivial sense of non-material, which applies to any functional as opposed to observable state, with the pregnant sense of immaterial only by resurrecting Locke's view of how meaning attaches to inscriptions, the view which Wittgenstein and Sellars attack. For Locke, the meaningfulness, the intentional character of an inscription was the result of its production by, or encoding of, an idea. An idea, in turn, was what is before a man's mind when he thinks. So the way to see the intentional as the immaterial is to say that neither a sequence of processes in the brain nor some ink on paper can represent anything unless an idea, something of which we are aware in that immediate way in which we are aware of pains, has impregnated it. In a Lockean view, when we walk through Leibniz's factory, we do not see thoughts, not because, as for Wittgenstein, we cannot yet translate brainwriting, but because we cannot see those invisible, because non-spatial entities which infuse the visible with intentionality. For Wittgenstein, what makes things representational or intentional is the part they play in a larger context, in interaction with large numbers of other visible things. For Locke, what makes things representational is a special causal thrust, what Chisholm describes as the phenomenon of sentences deriving intentionality from thoughts, as the moon derives its light from the sun. So our answer to the question, how can we convince ourselves that the intentional must be immaterial, is, first, we must convince ourselves, following Locke and Chisholm, and passe Wittgenstein and Sellars, that intentionality is intrinsic only in phenomenal items directly before the mind. If we accept that answer, however, we are still only part of the way to resolving the issue. For since the problem with which we have been wrestling has been caused precisely by the fact that beliefs do not have phenomenal properties, we now have to ask how Locke, following Descartes, can conflate pains and beliefs under the common term idea, how he can convince himself that a belief is something which is before the mind, in the way in which a mental image is, how he can use the same ocular imagery for mental images and for judgments. I shall discuss the origin of this Cartesian Lockean use of the term idea below, but for the moment I shall pass over the issue and come to the second subdivision of the question, why should the mental be thought of as immaterial? Namely, why should the phenomenal be thought of as immaterial? Why do some neo-dualist philosophers say that how something feels, what it is like to be something, cannot be identical with any physical property, or at least any physical property which we know anything about? A trivial answer to this question would be that we can know all about something's physical properties and not know how it feels, especially if we can't talk to it. Consider the claims that babies and bats and Martians and God and panpsychistically viewed rocks all may inhabit different phenomenal quality spaces from those we inhabit. So they may. But what does this have to do with non-physicality? Presumably, those who say that the phenomenal is non-physical are not complaining that being told how the atoms of the bat's brain are laid out will not help one feel like a bat. Understanding about the physiology of pain does not help us feel pain either, but why should we expect it to, any more than understanding aerodynamics will help us fly? How can we get from the undoubted fact that knowing how to use a physiological term, e.g. stimulation of C fibers, will not necessarily help us use a phenomenological term, e.g. pain, to an ontological gap between the reference of the two terms? How can we get from the fact that knowing Martian physiology does not help us translate what the Martian says when we damage his tissues to the claim that he's got something immaterial we haven't got? How, to come to the point, do we know when we have two ways of talking about the same thing, a person or his brain, rather than descriptions of two different things? And why are neo-dualists so certain that feelings and neurons are an instance of the latter? I think that the only reply such philosophers have to offer is to point out that in the case of phenomenal properties, there is no appearance-reality distinction. This amounts to defining a physical property as one which anybody could be mistaken in attributing to something, and a phenomenal property as one which a certain person cannot be mistaken about. E.g., the person who has the pain cannot be mistaken about how the pain feels. Given this definition, of course, it is trivially the case that no phenomenal property can be a physical one. But why should this epistemic distinction reflect an ontological distinction? Why should the epistemic privilege we all have of being incorrigible about how things seem to us reflect a distinction between two realms of being? The answer presumably has to go something like this. Feelings just are appearances. Their reality is exhausted in how they seem. They are pure seemings. Anything that is not a seeming, putting the intentional to one side for the moment, is merely physical. That is, it is something which can appear other than it is. The world comes divided into things whose nature is exhausted by how they appear, and things whose nature is not. But if a philosopher gives this answer, he is in danger of changing from a neo-dualist into a plain old-fashioned Cartesian dualist, mind stuff and all. For now he has stopped talking about pains as states of people, or properties predicated of people, and started talking about pains as particulars, a special sort of particular whose nature is exhausted by a single property. Of what could such a particular be made, save mind stuff? Or to put it another way, what could mind stuff be, save something out of which such thin, wispy, and translucent things can be made? As long as feeling painful is a property of a person or of brain fibers, there seems no reason for the epistemic difference between reports of how things feel and reports of anything else to produce an ontological gap. But as soon as there is an ontological gap, we are no longer talking about states or properties, but about distinct particulars, distinct subjects of predication. The neo-dualist, who identifies a pain with how it feels to be in pain, is hypostasizing a property, painfulness, into a special sort of particular, a particular of that special sort whose esse is percipi, and whose reality is exhausted in our initial acquaintance with it. The neo-dualist is no longer talking about how people feel, but about feelings as little self-subsistent entities, floating free of people in the way in which universals float free of the instantiations. He has, in fact, modelled pains on universals. It is no wonder, then, that he can intuit that pains can exist separately from the body, for this intuition is simply the intuition that universals can exist independently of particulars. That special sort of subject of predication, whose appearance is its reality, phenomenal pain, turns out to be simply the painfulness of the pain, abstracted from the person having the pain. It is, in short, the universal painfulness itself. To put it oxymoronically, mental particulars, unlike mental states of people, turn out to be universals. This then is the answer I want to give to the question, why do we think of the phenomenal as immaterial? We do so because, as Ryle put it, we insist on thinking of having a pain in ocular metaphors, of having a funny sort of particular before the eye of the mind. That particular turns out to be a universal, a quality hypostatized into a subject of predication. Thus, when neo-dualists say that how pains feel are essential to what pains are, and then criticize Smart for thinking of the causal role of certain neurons as what is essential to pain, they are changing the subject. Smart is talking about what is essential to people being in pain, whereas neo-dualists like Kripke are talking about what is essential for something's being a pain. Neo-dualists feel unafraid of the question, what is the epistemological basis for your claim to know what is an essential property of pain? For they have arranged things so that pains have only one intrinsic property, namely, feeling painful, and so the choice of which properties are to count as essential to them is obvious. Let me now summarize the results of this section. I have said that the only way to associate the intentional with the immaterial is to identify it with the phenomenal, and that the only way to identify the phenomenal with the immaterial is to hypostatize universals and think of them as particulars rather than abstractions from particulars, thus giving them a non-spatio-temporal habitation. It turns out, in other words, that the universal-particular distinction is the only metaphysical distinction we have got, the only one which moves anything at all outside of space, much less outside of space-time. The mental physical distinction then is parasitic on the universal particular distinction, rather than conversely. Further, the notion of mind stuff, as that out of which pains and beliefs are made, makes exactly as much or as little sense as the notion of that of which universals are made. The battle between realists and conceptualists over the status of universals is thus empty, because we have no idea of what a mind is, save that it is made of whatever universals are made of. In constructing both a Lockean idea and a Platonic form, we go through exactly the same process. We simply lift off a single property from something, the property of being red, or painful, or good, and then treat it as if it itself were a subject of predication, and perhaps also a locus of causal efficacy. A Platonic form is merely a property considered in isolation, and considered as capable of sustaining causal relations. A phenomenal entity is precisely that as well.